Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley. Every week, we bring you a presentation that we hope will inspire you in some fashion, especially with regard to how Rotary works. That is our motto, service above self. Our club, the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley, has a special interest in innovation, education, and entrepreneurship. And today, our program is going to be with Sharda Sekaran, who is with Translators Without Borders. She is the head of fundraising and communications for the organization. She is an American, but living in Copenhagen, and it is a pleasure to have you with us today. Sharda, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rushton. It's a real honor to be here. I appreciate you inviting us. I'm happy to share the work that we do. I think you'll find there's a lot that's really interesting and innovative, and hopefully you'll get your creative juices flowing, and we'll think about ways that you might be able to get involved with the work that we do at Translators Without Borders. So just a little bit of a background on the organization. Our work and our mission is to share information and to cross language barriers. The reason that we do the work that we do is because over half of the world's population suffers from lack of access to information in their language. Language barriers prevent people from getting vital information and communicating their needs and ideas proactively. In particular, people who are poor, less literate, and come from underserved languages are left without a voice in the development of the places where they live, the futures of their families, and in important global conversations. One of the things that is important to think about when we look at underserved languages is that the people, it's not so much necessarily in terms of numbers of speakers of a language. It's really in terms of lack of access to information and technology and building data sets that can get information and translations to the world's most vulnerable people in a language that they understand. TWB was founded in 2010 and has expanded rapidly to meet the growing realization that vital and often life-saving information must be in formats that people understand. We provide people access to vital knowledge in their language by providing aid in humanitarian crises response through translation and interpreting. We provide translation and simplification services that are culturally appropriate, accessible, and open source. We build language translation capacity at the local level, and we also raise awareness globally about the importance of language in humanitarian work and day-to-day services for people who are in need. Some highlights about our work in 2019, there were about 20 million words we translated. We have 30,000 people in our community of translators. The backbone for Translators Without Borders are volunteers. We started as a volunteer effort of people who had language and translation expertise who wanted to provide services to the humanitarian world. We came as a direct response to the Haiti earthquake in 2010 when there was a need to get information into Haitian Creole. And we built a volunteer base that has flourished ever since then of translators who represent about 200 language pairs, so combinations of languages. We've got a wide range covered in our volunteer community. We work closely with other organizations, with NGOs as partners, to look at how they can use language to advance their work. We provide technical support. We do translation services. We also do making language and information culturally accessible to local populations through visualization and audio and visual. And we work with about 160 NGOs to do that. And we work in deployment of new technologies, both in terms of rapid response, but also in terms of ongoing language support where it's needed most. A little bit more about our work and why it's so important. I think for many of us, like me, I'm originally from the US, I'm an American living in Copenhagen. For me and other English speakers, we're finding it easier and easier to navigate in the world. When we need information, we find a lot of people who speak English, and when we have gaps, even we can use information and technology like translation apps on our phones, things that I use every day to help me navigate and get by as an English speaker in a non-English dominant environment, but with lots of people who speak English. I feel I'm able to navigate and get by pretty well, even though I don't speak the dominant tongue. But for people who don't speak the dominant language, it can often be a life or death situation and not just an inconvenience not to be able to speak in your own language. I'm going to give you a little bit of an instance of how this works in terms of data and machine, and one of the needs that Translators Without Borders is seeking to fill. There's a paucity of data available in a lot of different languages that are less served by technology. So not necessarily spoken by small numbers of people, but for whom resources are scarce, or there hasn't been a robust investment in building data sets to make effective and accurate machine translations. So this is, in a life or death situation, what a machine translation would look like. Basically what we did was we took something in English, a life or death word sentence that has to do with airline and evacuation, and as a test, we took that and translated it with translators into another language, and then we used machine translation to translate it back into English. And the point that I'm going to be making is that depending on the data set, there's a wide variability in the accuracy of the translation that you'll get. So for Hausa, which was spoken by 44 million people, when we had this sentence translated and then translated back by a machine, we got something that's fairly unintelligible. Air pollution is under your control. Put it on top of your head and tie it to your body. You can only ventilate the air when you leave the boat. So that's kind of hard to make any sense out of. We look now at Burmese when we did the same sort of experiment, and we get something that's a little bit different, but also relatively incomprehensible. Your life jackets are under your seat. This is putting your head to form on your own. Cotton, after leaving the plane on your life jackets in the air breath bed. So that's what a machine translation would look like for a Burmese person of that sentence, again, spoken by 32 million people. And now if we look at one other language, Turkish, spoken by 75.7 million people, what we get is a little bit more accuracy, but also confusing. We see that is the same thing in the case of many languages. Here's Chinese, spoken by 1.2 billion people. We have an improving data set with Chinese and greater investments, so now you're getting a slightly more accurate machine translation with that in mind. But then if we look at other languages like Lithuanian, all of a sudden we're getting a vast improvement in the accuracy of the translation. You will find a life jacket under your seat. Put it over your head and trim your straps. Inflate the vest only after leaving the aircraft. Similarly, we see a much more accurate translation if we do the same thing in Greek. And the reason for that is all about data. It's because the EU has a robust investment in accuracy of machine translations. And if you speak a European language, even if it's spoken by far fewer people, we have a combined of 15 million as opposed to what we saw on the other page, which was more than 140 million. I think we had a much larger pool of people in terms of numbers, but a much smaller data set to work from. So this is where Translators Without Borders comes in. We are basically trying to invest in filling the need for languages that are underinvested in. What this looks like visually, the data set question is, if you look at French, for instance, we have a very robust amount of data. English and French have virtually parallel content. In Canada, everything is translated into both English and French, websites, government documents, and machine translation. French and Spanish are pretty close, or there's a lot of accuracy there. But there's no machine translation engines or very poor quality for marginalized languages. If we look here at Kanuri or Rohingya, there's a real dearth of data there, and the machine translations will be fairly inaccurate or pretty impossible. At TWB, we have the capacity to build this data as an organization that has an expertise in language, but also that understands the humanitarian context and is building open source platforms to build the data sets that can fill that need. What we're doing at TWB is we are investing in innovative language technology. One of the most powerful innovations that we're offering is leveraging language technology to help people who speak those marginalized languages so they can communicate and access information in their own language. Our results have so far included the first and only machine translation engine for Kurdish languages and a text audio terminology online offline app for key Rohingya words and phrases. TWB won the language tech industry's prestigious Taos Game Changer Innovation Award for Caddo Speak, which is our text and voice translation memory, building the foundation for voice-based machine translation. Gamayun is our big area of focus. This is core to TWE's vision for the future. Gamayun is named after a prophetic bird of Slavic folklore, a symbol of wisdom and knowledge. And what the initiative is doing is it's basically, if you remember the graph on a previous slide that showed the paucity of language data sets available for certain language pairs and the effect this has on machine translation accuracy, and that it leaves speakers of those languages with nonsense or no critical information in their own languages at all. Gamayun is our solution. It's a collaborative effort with tech partners, with tech partners, native speaker communities, NGOs, and content creators and owners. It uses text and speech data to automate translation in underserved languages. Using a repeatable, scalable model, TWB and our coalitions of partners are piloting 3 languages: Hausa, Bangla, and Swahili. I'm getting over a cold, so I'll have a little sip of tea. So we're piloting 3 languages, Hausa, Bangla, and Swahili, to test and refine the process with the aim of bringing 20 underserved languages online over the next 10 years. It's a revolutionary way to use cutting-edge technology for humanitarian benefit, and it helps us to close the language equality gap and enable rapid translation and two-way communications. So that's a big part of our focus. And we're not the only ones who think this is a great idea. We've already gotten some high-level industry buy-in from Cisco and Microsoft, and we're actively looking for more partners and supporters to drive the Gamayun vision forward. So I'll hold us off at just one last thought about the importance of language and communicating in a first language of a speaker. Our research has shown us that people's comprehension of health information increases by 78% when the information is in their native language versus their second language. So our focus is on getting as much information as possible into people's first languages. And that's the work that we're focused on, using technology, community, know-how from the humanitarian field and the translation sector to innovate. So I'll leave it at that and see if you have any questions for me.
Fantastic, Sharda. Excellent presentation. And I understand that the slides that you are showing us are slides that we'll be able to make available, and that they contain a lot of other content as well. Is that right?
Absolutely. There's some more information. I didn't get into a lot of our impact, and what we've found in the field has been the results of having greater accessibility of language. And so there'll be more data on that in the slides, and also information about what people who are interested in helping our cause can do to support us.
Very cool. I know that Farheen, your time might be a little tight, so I'd like to hand it over to you first for any comments or questions.
Great. Yeah. Sharda, thank you so much for your presentation. I really thought it was brilliant. And, something that, so I work at a doctor's office, and, and the staff, we all speak Japanese. And interestingly, most of our patients are Japanese, and very often they come to us specifically because of that language barrier, right? And a lot of the what ends up happening very often is that the husbands get transferred to the United States, and they can speak English very well, but their wives and their children can't. And so when they're trying to get medical care, they feel uncomfortable going to English speaking doctors because they can't communicate very well, so they end up coming to us. And so I see what you're talking about every day, about how important language is, and again, language barriers. So I really, really appreciate the work that your organization does. And I just have one quick question. Really, it's about Google Translate. I'm really curious about how you rank Google Translate in terms of a machine translation service. Like, is it pretty good, or is it not so good? So I'm really curious. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I wanted to just address the first piece that you brought up, which is around equity and gender, which is something that's a really big deal. having a greater accessibility of language and reaching underserved languages is a big step towards global equity and having greater, parity for people who are from poorer communities. But also it's really important in terms of gender. What we found in our studies is that in terms of language accessibility and education levels, and typically what we'll find is in the dominant language for a region, the bigger languages that require more formal education, there's a huge gap between men and women, between children and the elderly. So even in terms of addressing equity within a community, beyond the whole geo scope of equity on the globe, if we just look at communities, having accessibility of language is really key to equity between genders, between ages, and addressing people who are less likely to be served in a community. So that's really important. And then Google translates on availability of the data set. So I speak English and I speak French and some Spanish and Danish. And I can even see the difference in data sets within those languages, but never mind if I were looking for information in Rohingya or Kanuri, because those data sets aren't there. What we find is the platforms are really very robust. Of course, Google Translate is an incredible tool for a lot of us in our day-to-day lives, but without the data set there, it's not something that is as useful for people who speak languages that are marginalized. So what we want to do is we're happy for those tools to exist in the world, and we're happy to have the benefit of the data set that we develop through Gamayun, so that we can hopefully help make tools like that more accessible for a broader set of languages.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. And I actually have to head off to work, but it was really lovely to meet you. And I'm looking forward to watching the presentation later for what Russian has to say. So thank you so much, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much. So a bit of a long lead up to this question. When we think about the potential of technology and we think about access to the world's information, there is a sense, especially here in Silicon Valley, it's like, look at what's happening. You could be on an island in the middle of nowhere, and if you've got an internet connection, you can take MIT classes and you can do this and you can do that, and all of that's true if you speak the language that the information is provided in, right? And so when I think about the work that you've described, especially with regard to to health information being a bit of a focus, I want, or maybe the focus. I wonder what else within the context of language becomes important for the organization. So, for example, being kind of proud of one's culture and language in order to contribute to the development of data sets. Seeing education as a possibility, not merely to access things in dominant languages, but also for the opportunity that it might bring you to bring to your community, right? Are there elements of the work of Translators Without Borders that speak to those kind of personal and social pieces of what you hope will happen as a result of your work?
Yeah, and help me if this doesn't fully answer the question, but I think there certainly is a sense that there's a wide range of information that we have at our fingertips, and the world seems like a much more connected place, especially for those of us who speak English or a dominant language. And there is certainly a sense to which having greater accuracy and greater inclusion of machine translation, having language be more of a centerpiece of thought in reaching out to new communities, it opens up for greater access for people who are in communities that aren't on the grid, so to speak, when it comes to language and technology. But it's also a two-way transformation in the conversation. It's a fundamental paradigm shift, especially for the humanitarian sector, where I think the power dynamic has been traditionally very much from the top down, and the people who are the recipients of the services or who are having their own experiences on the community level, on the very personal level, don't necessarily have ownership or even the ability to have a two-way dialogue about how they experience their own lives, how they describe themselves, and how they engage in the global community. What's really interesting about this is it's a represents the possibility for a big transformation in that, and giving people their own agency and their own voices to be able to speak on their behalf, and also to communicate to the service providers, communicate back to people who are providing them information, and provide us with a more robust understanding of where they're coming from personally, politically, socially, economically. It's a big change in how we even look at how we communicate to people who are the recipients of aid. I don't know if that kind of answers you.
Well, it does. It does. It makes me think about, that sense of the moment. And you mentioned that impact, for example, is there's information in the slides about this, but as I think about the impact of individual moments, whether it's a moment where someone needed healthcare and they go from a, kind of a confusion like, what do you mean I have control over the air pollution? To something that allows them to be confident that the medical treatment they're about to receive from a doctor is going to be, what they need, right? That there would be lots of moments where individual people who speak underserved languages would feel this kind of power of like, oh my God, thank God that you're here, right? It's so good to have this tool or these people or whatever it may be. Are those stories that are captured as a part of your impact? I mean, how do you talk about impact when you talk about the work of Translators Without Borders?
That's an excellent question. I mean, there's certainly the anecdotal impact. We have a quote that we use. It's at the end of this slide, and it's from a Rohingya refugee saying, when I speak my own language, I am free. When I hear someone else speak Rohingya, I feel like I am home. So for people their languages haven't been the priority, they've been definitely on the margin. It is kind of a big sense of a transformation and sense of self and pride to see your language prioritized. And there's another quote, I think, from Northeast Nigeria of one of our field workers who had someone who said, after we were working on getting machine translation into their local language, said, wow, I didn't think my language was important enough to be on the internet, or that all of a sudden being heard. Or some people who've said, I haven't seen my native tongue written in years. And it's kind of a validation and emotional transformation in addition to just looking at the statistics. I mean, in terms of the statistics, we have been able to do some studies, for instance, of the Rohingya, and have found, just in a year of doing our work there, where we provided glossaries and also translations into Rohingya and Chittagonian, that there was in just a year, a very marked increase in terms of comprehension. I think it was from 2017 to 18, we found that 27% of Rohingya refugees felt they had information on available assistance. And then when we studied that same population a year later, and in part due to our work, 84% said they felt that they had information available on assistance. So that's a 60% increase. So what we get from people, we do have a challenge of sometimes measuring our impact directly because we're kind of part of a whole suite of services, so there's work being done in a community, and we're part of what helps to make that work done more efficiently. And increasing and improving efficiencies and increasing access are sometimes a little hard to get a concrete measure on. But every time we do have an opportunity to see the impact of the retention of information, whether it's health or other education, or just crucial information about how to get services people may need in a camp for refugees or internally displaced people, we see a dramatic improvement when that language is in the communities or the speaker's first language and their mother tongue. So those are some examples of what we've been able to see in terms of outcome. And then there's just the awareness shift. I found it unusual. I didn't expect to find that there need to be some persuasion to make sure that there's language mapping that's part of any sort of assessment, if there's a need to deliver services or if there's a crisis, to have an understanding of what people speak locally, to have a sense of their education level and how to make information as accessible as possible for them. And we may think that this is common sense, but it's not necessarily standard practice yet. And so raising that awareness and just getting language to become more central in the planning process, for aid work, for humanitarian work, for everything that we do when we're entering an arena where there's a difference in language and there's a barrier, and not assuming that having it in French or Portuguese or English is going to be enough to reach the people who need it the most.
Phenomenal. You've mentioned the Rohingya a number of times. We actually had scheduled a person to record to speak to us a couple of years ago, and it was about the time the situation in Myanmar just suddenly devolved right into the mess that it still is. So thank you for the work you do to help those people and to help people all over the world. It's fantastic. Just as a final thought, I'm a former language teacher, all right, and love language. I've kind of rediscovered some of that love through online resources in the last couple of years. The Duolingo app is something that I find just a lot of fun, right? It's a free app that gamifies working with a language. So I am kind of curious if there is something about your experience in Denmark that has reminded you on a personal level of the fun of language learning.
Yeah, I'm a great lover of language too. I studied French for a lot of years and then Spanish and dabbled in Portuguese, even spoke a little Shona from my time studying abroad and undergrad in Zimbabwe. I've tried to pick up Tamil, which is really hard for me, but a family background, but I didn't grow up speaking it. So, and I'm now learning Danish. I think it's one thing is it's just personally for me revived a love for how much you gain from learning a language, the windows that you get into worlds that you wouldn't otherwise have access to, all the times that I've been grateful in my travels that I've even been able to communicate, even if it's in a fledgling, struggling way, how that's changed the perception of me and my possibilities and how excited people are when you're an English speaker who even makes the effort. So I think, love of language, certainly, and also the realization of how challenging it is when a lot of information that affects your life aren't in your first language. The number of times I've had to get help just to understand, official government documents that are sent to me in Danish and lots of things that go on that even though I'm in a country where English is the unofficial second language and lots of people speak it, there have been lots of times where I've also felt a level of vulnerability that's maybe different for an American, that I can't read this document that's affecting my life and I have to ask someone else to get help to know that these decisions that are affecting me are, that I have accurate information about it, has led me to think a lot about that, the vulnerability piece of when you don't have access to information that you can feel confident in, or your language skills aren't such that you are able to have full command over your environment. And it's made me think a lot more in terms of just sympathetically about what that's like for people who are having much bigger challenges than me as an English speaker in a Scandinavian country. So yeah.
Perfect. I'll hand it back to you in a moment for a final word, but as we've hit the end of our time, I'll do the usual finish. Members and guests, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have enjoyed this recording and this program, and I hope that you will join us each week as an opportunity to be inspired on how you might be of service to others. We hope that you will do two things. First, that you will let us know you are here, right? There's an attendance form just below, and visiting Rotarians, if you fill that out properly and properly spell your email address, then you should get a note that you can pass along to your club secretary to make up a miss. And then there's also a discussion session at the bottom. Let us know what you thought of the program, of the meeting as a whole, and we welcome the opportunity to engage with you in that space as well. So with that, I will hand it back to Sharda for the final word.
Thank you. Well, I'll just emphasize what our mission is. Translators Without Borders is working towards a world where knowledge knows no language barriers. And we're always open to innovative ideas and creative partners. There's so much room for innovation and smart thinking in this area. So I hope that there'll be lots more exciting things to report, and maybe ways that you all can get involved and connect with us through your service.
Excellent. Everyone, we will see you next week.